Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 18th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as I mentioned previously, I am off traveling right now, so I am time traveling a bit and pre-recording this intro for the episode. I wanted to make sure that all of the listeners had plenty of content in my absence. So let's dive right into this week's show. It's a fascinating one for you. I had the opportunity to sit down with Jennifer Banks. Now, she is a senior executive editor at Yale University Press, and she writes herself and actually draws upon that expertise that she's gathered, editing so many brilliant books and really developing a lot of deep insights, especially into kind of moral philosophy. So she has this fascinating new book. It's called Natality, Toward a Philosophy of Birth. And she really digs deep into natality, sort of the counterpoint to mortality, right? Birth and death. And she draws on insights of brilliant writers, thinkers, philosophers throughout sort of our history. And yeah, we're going to dig deep into this concept. It's really interesting. It's really fascinating. So without further ado, here she is, Jennifer Banks. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk about your book, Natality, Toward a Philosophy of Birth. Is that how you pronounce it, Natality?
Yes, I say natality. Some people say natality. I hear both. Both seem accepted.
And so the idea here, when we think about the word natality, obviously what comes to mind is, or for me at least, is birth, but also mortality. This idea of thinking or reflecting on the fact that we were born, what it means to be thrust into existence. Like, I'm really curious what drew you first to this topic, and be like how you even how you found out that this was a topic. It's kind of a weird way to ask that, but yeah, how you started grappling with this idea.
Yeah. So I came to Natality. I kind of stumbled upon it. I was working at the time as an editor in the same position I am in now at Yale University Press, where I was working in the humanities, publishing books by, philosophers and literary scholars, theologians, people kind of working across these areas. And I gave birth to my first child. This was about 14 years ago, and returned to work, and had the experience that I think very often new mothers have, of just feeling that they had been unprepared for the experience. One of the lines you tend to hear is, why did no one tell me what this was like? There does seem to be a shock. In our culture, I don't know the degree to which it is something experienced less in other times and places. It's really hard to assess that, but it's certainly part of our culture, is this sense of unpreparedness. And so I, had a very short maternity break, returned to work, and was really hungering for interpretations that were at the level of the kind of projects that I was seeing coming through on other topics, but applied to birth. And I was at that time seeing a lot that was on death. These were books I was publishing, that the publisher I was working for was publishing. They were also just out there in the marketplace, getting a lot of attention. They were on bestseller lists, winning major literary prizes. And there was, at that time, a course on the Yale campus that I believe was the most popular course on campus, and it was just on death, taught by a philosopher. So we had, undergrads were lining up to take this course. And it seemed strange to me that there would be such an interest in death, but that I wasn't seeing the same kind of high-level interest in birth. I think it was there in the culture in other ways, in terms of kind of celebrity version, cover of magazines, and it kind of depicted in various reality TV shows at the time, but didn't seem so much a part of a kind of academic discourse, philosophic discourse. And so I stumbled upon mention of natality. It was in a proposal I received, and it was, just the author briefly mentioned Hannah Arendt in her articulation of natality, which she had developed in the wake of the Holocaust. And this was about the question of how do we begin again as a civilization? And she put birth at the center of her own thinking on that topic. So really, it began there and became just a kind of somewhat haphazard process of discovery over the next decade or so, just finding birth and always looking for it in unlikely places and trying to kind of stitch together what natality could mean as a broader framework, not just Arendt's definition of it or one thinker's definition for it or a specific argument, but to think about, natality or birth as broadly as we would think about death and mortality as a kind of key fact of human existence.
It's so funny that your experience, because you are and were working as an editor, right? In like sort of academic trade, but also academic publications, your experience was that you were seeing so much discourse about death. And because I am an academic it's weird to say that now, but I am an academic who specifically focuses both in a clinical practice, but also in a research orientation on death. And I find that, yes, of course, there is quite a bit of academic discourse about it because I do think it's an important philosophic topic, and it has been for since the beginning of time. But as a society, I find that we are like very death avoidant. We don't like talking about it. It's super taboo. And as a society, birth is freaking everywhere. And so it's so interesting that we have, I think in some ways aligned, but also very different views about these two bookends of life.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think that's absolutely true. I think in a way, the overexposure of birth, or at least of particular versions of it, kind of hides death. It also hides the ways that mortality is a part of natality too, that the two are very much entwined, and they are both about human limitations in some ways, about, how our lives don't go on forever. They have beginnings and they have ends. And these are really hard things for us to wrap our minds around.
I often wonder, because my background is more existentially oriented, and because I would kind of identify myself as somebody who's more of an atheistic existential speaker, I really identify with this concept that we often see of thrownness, this idea that we were thrown into existence. Our parents, whoever they might be, had sex, they procreated, it formed us biologically. We did not consult with anybody. We did not approve this decision. Yet, all of a sudden, here we were thrust into existence. And then over time, we started to develop an understanding of what it means to exist in the world and have an intersubjective experience. And this really resonates with me deeply, but I find that this is like never a topic of conversation. I don't know why, but I feel like even trying to explain that idea to people, they often look at me kind of sideways, like, what do you mean by this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard for people to think about birth at any deeper level. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I think some of it is that we don't have the same sort of tradition behind us, of sources that we can draw on, training that we can draw on. It's also kind of practical too, that we don't remember our own births, so it's hard to think about. I'm raising children now, and it's always a shock to me that they just don't remember like the first 5 years of their lives. So you really can't get close in your own memory to that experience. What we have is death ahead of us, and many of us avoid that too. But there is a kind of inevitable wrestling with that fact that we will go through in our lives. But it's also, birth can be a happy experience. So there's a way in which, if you have a child, it consumes you with the work that's associated with it, and you're busy. But it's also, potentially joyful, not always. Obviously, it's an incredibly emotionally complex experience for most people. But I think death, there is still sort of rituals of mourning around death that we don't really have to the same degree around birth. So we have, there just aren't that many occasions to really think about that fact. And again,
It's so
there's not a tradition.
interesting. It
Mm-hmm.
like I just I don't know why I feel so differently than that. I feel like there's like our culture is obsessed with birth, and there's like the showers and the gender reveals and like a million gifts and a million different ways that we like celebrate the idea of birth, yet we don't have as much ritual around death. And so much of what I do in therapy is helping people develop and create. Like there's the funeral, but that's usually like it. And it's fascinating that I often struggle with the idea that individuals like myself who choose to be child free, our culture and our society, it's like the idea that somebody has a child is viewed as this like massive cultural accomplishment that's really, really celebrated in a way that's very different than like a lot of other women's accomplishments.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot. I think for most people who have had a child, their minds change on that subject, because I think that, to have a baby shower where you get a bunch of onesies, to have someone put a, balloon on your mailbox, these are not things that are particularly helpful when it really comes down to the fact that you're going to be torn in half. You're going to likely be massively sleep deprived. You have to figure out how to financially, emotionally, physically support a whole other human who's completely dependent on you. These are the things that the culture doesn't offer much to. Yes, they will celebrate you getting pregnant. It's all great. There will be the reality TV show that has the pregnant woman. Everyone's cheering, but we don't really have really much in place that goes to a deeper level. It's a symbol, it's sugar coated, it's kind of glossed over. And even for people for whom it is, the best experience of their life, the most joyful, the most positive, even for those people, it's often the most difficult experience they've been through, certainly physically, but also emotionally, psychologically. And I think that what's hard is that for people who, all of these things are wrapped up together, it's really hard to untangle them. And I don't know, so much about what sort of resources are available, and how they would compare for, let's say, end of life care, or for people who are mourning the death of someone in their family. But I do know that, there's not that much in terms of postnatal counseling. The resources that are available are very, very few and far between. And so, I have a woman 8 miles down the street from me in the spring, was going through postnatal depression and passed over evidently into psychosis, experts think, and murdered her 3 children. And she was, everyone said she was this incredibly loving mother. She absolutely loved being a mother. She was a labor and delivery nurse who had devoted her life to birth, to supporting families who were bringing new children into the world. This was, this was her life. And then it just turned, and she had been through all kinds of medical care, and she had been in an institution, and she had been through lots of rounds of medication, but the system clearly failed her. And what came out when that story, and you probably heard this story in the news, but what came out, I think, were a lot of women talking about this and saying, like, there's nothing like this that prepares you. Having a baby shower does not prepare you for what a lot of people go through. And something like postnatal psychosis is fairly rare, but not completely rare. And something like postnatal depression is pretty common.
Yeah, I
Certainly.
think that that's an important distinction, right? Is that obviously postpartum depression is like a huge issue, and it's like I really do think there's a crisis of undertreatment, which maps back to a crisis of undertreating women and of not recognizing women's symptoms, and a lack of research in these areas. All of these the kind of systemic problems with our medical and mental health system, and that postpartum psychosis, like you mentioned, it is somewhat rare. And so that's why I think when we think about these extreme outcomes, this woman sadly having this mental health crisis and then ultimately harming her children, uh, I guess an equal and opposite version with that in the grief process might be, somebody dying by suicide after they lose a loved one. And I think that sadly that is probably more common. Now, again, I don't think that this is all about the Olympics of what's worse and what's not. I think that all of our systems are failing, whether we're talking about support in grief around end of life or support in the mental health crises that come in the beginning. What I think is that there's an expectation that you're not going to be in a good way after somebody dies, but that you should just be super happy and always and just fine after birth. Like, you asked for this, it's a gift. Why are you being negative? And that to me is the most insidious problem, is that we just don't understand as a society that this is complex and intense and painful. And we also obviously don't offer like good maternity or paternity care at all. Like, at all. But is this a particularly American, or maybe I should say Western problem?
Well, it's a little hard to know. I mean, I hesitate about making a lot of sweeping generalizations because we don't have a lot of information on, the history doesn't give us a lot about what the experience of birthing women, postnatal women was. We just don't have a lot of that. And it was frustrating to me in researching the book, and quite haunting that those absences were there. I think there are things that are unique in our culture, that are unique to our time period, that have changed our relationship both to birth but also to death. Some of it is just that, our positive developments, that we, for instance, live longer, that we have higher, lower rates of infant mortality, of maternal mortality. And these are obviously very positive things, but they happen very quickly, and, in the span of a couple of generations, and maybe, a century or so, let's say. And they change, how we understand these things when we're not living as closely to them. I think when women were having more births, when those births were deadlier, which obviously they still can be, but where there were higher rates of child mortality, but also, when the average lifespan was in the 30s, I think death was understood as being more present, being more a part of the birth process, being kind of more right there on the horizon. And, the period of adulthood was for many people much shorter. So there wasn't, in many ways, we're living through this experiment, where we live further from our own births and our own deaths, and in certain ways in our culture, we're insulated from them. Even in terms of the ways our societies are built and structured, and the architecture and the kind of built environment, is we're kind of protected, we're insulated, in ways that when you go to other cultures, kind of that threat of death can feel more omnipresent. And obviously for certain people in our communities, it still feels very much that way. I don't know exactly how that changes, but it certainly, I imagine, relates to the areas you work in. It's a different psychology. To be a woman in your 40s and to feel like I hopefully have another 40 years to go is different. It allows you to your mind to develop, to go through different experiences, to assimilate them, to reflect on them, to think about birth different ways, to think about death in different ways, to have, just a greater number of experiences with all of these things, but also slightly, perhaps less acute.
Hmm. I guess it's, I was also thinking really about our relationship with with care, our relation, how women who are pregnant are treated in our healthcare system, that we even see this as a healthcare concern. I recently had a friend who had a baby, and one of the experiences that she had was this medicalization of her birth that was really frustrating for her, like wherein she was a contractor and was trying to figure out how to get appropriate maternity leave. And they were like, oh, you just have to take like sick time. Like you have to take
Hmm.
medical leave. It's like, but I'm not sick.
Yeah.
This isn't a medical issue. I had a baby.
Yeah, and I mean, my maternity leave was technically called a disability leave, which says a lot
Like,
that we
what?
don't have another,
Yeah. Like,
you
and I
know,
feel like, is that specifically American? Because it kind of feels like it is.
it does. It does sound specifically American, but I would imagine that, I think there is that aspect of disability that has probably always been part of, this history too, even with things like, women who are menstruating were not allowed into temples, or,
Right. Yeah.
the parts of women's bodies that somehow didn't conform to what was normative, or was fit for the company of males at that time, was excluded, was somehow not allowed into certain kind of spaces. So I think that probably has always been there. Of course, we have more kind of technocratic discourse or labels to apply to things. Um, yeah, and I think that I'm a big fan of modern medicine for sure, and I never particularly warmed to a lot of the discourse around natural birth, and
Yeah, because it
um,
can be quite dangerous as well. Yeah.
yeah, and I felt like in some ways it established these expectations which were unrealistic and that were kind of limiting. I knew a lot of women who wanted to have these natural births, and things didn't go their way and they felt incredibly disappointed, but they had this perfectly healthy baby and it seemed
Right, but
kind
they
of ridiculous.
felt shame or like a failure, and that was a huge concern of mine with this friend, not to out them, but they ended up having a, quote, "natural," breech birth, and I was super scared for her.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
like,
And
"What are you doing?" So I think that there is that risk that you can kind of go too far in one direction. I also agree that some things are too medicalized, and sometimes we're too quick to go C-section route, and we're too quick to, say, this is now risky, or I'm not going to listen to your concerns. Something's wrong. Well, you don't know what you're talking about. Stop talking, woman. I think that it can go both directions. Um,
yes, and it's
yeah.
absolutely been over medicalized. I mean, part of the reason I wrote the book is I felt like the books I found on the topic, they were medical books, they were kind of self-help books, or they were memoirs. There was this whole, amazing proliferation of memoirs that have come out over the last, say, 3 decades or so, which are really important. And the medical literature obviously is very important too. But there's a lot that doesn't capture. So I think medicine doesn't always capture the kind of existential or spiritual or just psychological dimensions, and then personal narratives sometimes are limited to a single person's story. And I think that I'm interested in how do we think of these more broadly as kind of a bigger part of the human experience, a bigger part of all of our cultures. Like, people are being born in all of our cultures. This is happening, and it's consequential. It's going to shape our politics, our economies, our communities, and to only think of these things in individualistic terms of whether I decide or I decide not to have a child, or only the need to tell one's personal story can kind of limit the ways we think about birth, which I think have to be larger. They also have to be individual too, of course.
Yeah, it's interesting sort of the that both of those things have to be true at the same time, because when we do think about, I don't know, what comes up for me, and again, like this is my own bias coming into play, and me trying to kind of be reflexive and grapple with my own biases, as an individual who's chosen to be child free, who then, after she chose to be child free, had a medical experience and now I couldn't have children even if I wanted to. So I chose it, and then the choice was taken from me, which weirdly sucked, even though I already knew I didn't want it. So that's a whole other like grappling that we could have. But as a person who comes from that perspective, I often struggle with the larger narrative. So when we do kind of back up out of the individual and into the collectivist, the sort of default larger narrative, especially I think in the West, is sort of like religiously influenced in a major way, like procreate, 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 more is always better, replenish the nation. It's like it kind of like blends into a nationalistic perspective. And so I'm curious in your views at that sort of level of resolution when it comes to thinking about birth as a means to, I guess build the population, build the army, maintain power.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think when we start talking about birth in terms of the numbers, we're always in trouble. And, what I think we need to realize is that this can go either way. It can go in a pronatal direction. It can go in an antenatal direction. So, this is an incredibly powerful thing, the birth of new human beings. This is, these are the people who will populate our nations or our armies or, they'll be our taxpayers, whatever. So I think that, powerful interests have always understood that. And to be able to control that is a enormous power. And so you do often hear this discourse of a kind of pronatalism that, this is our future. This is a good thing. We have to have these children. It's natural. It's how we produce our taxpayers, which is always the most depressing argument.
Right. Or sometimes literally
But
just this is what God wants. You do see
or
that
this
sort of
is
essentialist religious view.
Yes, yes, and but you also see the opposite side where that you see it in the eugenics movement. You see it in different kinds of antinatalist movements that there is an aversion to aspects of human life. Very often, it's connected to assumptions about what kind of person we want.
Right,
you,
exactly.
yeah. And so, I think we have to be careful because I think there is a very strong pronatal argument that runs through certain parts of our culture. But if you look carefully, it's very often also wrapped up with certain antinatalist strands. So you have things like, people who are, for instance, strongly pro-life in their rhetoric, also voicing concerns about things like great replacement theory. So there's this anxiety about certain groups of people producing too many, and of other groups being crowded out. And so is that pronatal, or is that about a kind of social sculpting, where
I
you.
agree. Yeah. And I think sometimes the flip side of that is that individuals who are engaging in, I think, careful discourse around population and around like what you think of as antenatal discourse is often not antenatal in the grand scheme of things. Like, they're both complicated. Like people who want to push back and say, yo, we've got to think about this from a reasonable perspective. We can't just produce, 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 produce without any forethought. I think they're often viewed as sort of this like dark underbelly. And then people will sort of bring up the eugenics conversations and bring up all of these worrisome conversations that I don't know if they necessarily map back in those situations.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is why I think that we always have to we have to think about what is human life? What kind of lives are we thinking about? How are we going to live them? In things like freedom, the ability of people to make these decisions about the most personal aspects of their lives, I think is a very important dimension to this. And in terms of not having children, I mean, this is throughout history, this has been an enormous part of our culture. Of course, there's an irony in some of the religion adopting certain kind of pro-natalist stance, because religions have been one of the places where there's actually been one of the kind of strongest and anti-natalist strands. That if you were going to devote yourself to God, you had to. That was a commitment. You
Yeah,
couldn't
you're
be.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, early Christians, there were strong anti-natalist evocations in that tradition. You go to something like Buddhism, to be born is to be endlessly wrapped in the cycles of human suffering, and the goal is ultimately to be freed from that. You might, there are parts of that tradition that would say, yes, have children, have a family, but very often that kind of slowed one down and was a diversion. And I think the traditions that were very apocalyptic, they really thought the end was near, and so they, the goal wasn't to kind of continue to populate the species. It was really to prepare for the end. And, I think in terms of those traditions themselves, they are somewhat more ambivalent. So you look at something like the Hebrew Bible and the story of Genesis, and you have these, you have God throughout the Hebrew Bible saying, be fruitful and multiply. But childbirth is connected with a curse in Genesis. It's connected with being thrown out of Eden and with a kind of suffering and exile, which isn't, a particularly positive account of what birth is. And then, of course, Adam and Eve have two children, and one of them kills kills the other. Um, I don't think this is actually a very cheery or one-dimensional account of what human birth is. I think part of the power of those stories is that they get at the complexity, and that there are, these things are always constrained by human limitations, and that
I would
things
also
don't.
argue that they get at the misogyny as well. Like, it's funny because my
Yeah,
first interpretation of this is sort of like, do it, be forth and multiply, but don't do it wrong, or don't do it exactly, but you're still going to be screwed even if you do it. And it just goes back to that like America Ferrera kind of quote in the Barbie movie. And like, these conversations that a lot of women have been having for a very long time, but that, kind of ebb and flow in the popular culture of sort of like, I can't win. I cannot win.
yeah,
I
yes.
do what you
I
asked
and
me to
I
do, and I'm doing it wrong. I can't ever do just the thing. And then you don't want to support me through this process. Yeah, it's a really tough thing. Like women are I think on the one hand, valued culturally as these goddess-like figures who have the power of creation in them, and on the other side of spectrum, it's like, now just do your domestic labor, and we don't actually want to support you through this process, and don't even think about taking maternity leave. It's a really weird signal we send.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's limited. I think that power is acknowledged, but then it's controlled. It's sort of, put into this niche category, where we only can think about it in certain ways. It's just relevant to those who are experiencing it. It's about a particular moment in time, rather than this being kind of at the center of all of our human experience. It's something we have all been through. And, part of what I loved in doing my research is that some of the people in my book were not parents themselves and never had children, didn't, Hannah Arendt didn't appear to want children, but she could understand the importance of birth in human life, not only as, an individual decision of whether I give birth or not, but as a kind of broader part of a human culture. And I think in terms of, I am not a pronatalist, certainly not when any kind of coercion is involved. But I do think that there is a kind of collective despair about, human future, which can be quite dangerous. This is some of the work I'm working on right now. I have an essay that's going to be on this topic.
Do you think it's valid? I mean, it might be dangerous, but do you think it's authentic? Do you see where it's coming from, this despair about our future?
I do. Yes. Yeah, I think there are, real questions about what our future is. I mean, even if you just think of it from a kind of environmental angle, there, what does it mean to bring a child into a world that may not be habitable in the ways it has been in the past for past generations? That's something that has scared people into not having children. Never mind things like, a nuclear threat that has been something we've been living with for close to a century now. And so, it's not just our lives, it's our parents, our grandparents. This is a pressure that has been upon us, real, maybe in the back of our minds at this point in time. It's not something that's, we're not, most of us, doing bomb drills under the desk the way my parents were. But then there are all these new threats, and, I'm reading a lot in the AI discourse and some of that literature. And, there's all kinds of alarmist bells going off there about the threats that AI poses to a human future. And, but I think what I see is that, and this was part of Hannah Arendt's critique too, is that there are dangerous things that can happen in a society when we collectively give up. And so it's not that yeah, and it's not that despair is unfounded, but that in a way we each have a responsibility to try to figure this out and to not just give up on the future. And some of the places that are sounding the alarms the most loudly, they're also trying to come up with solutions that to me are quite terrifying. So it's all quite tricky in our moment. But I think too that just to kind of make that distinction, that this isn't always about having a child oneself as much as thinking that there could be a future for the species and wanting to support the other lives that are out there and somehow affirming them, affirming the next generation and saying, we have some kind of responsibility to think about what your future might be.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because I think as an individual who has chosen not to have children, but who is very much engaged in social justice work and engaged in advocacy and engaged in the type of profession where that really is a motivator for me, is improving the state of the world for the individuals who inhabit it, and improving the opportunities for individuals who have systemically been sort of failed. I think that I guess the place where I start to get frustrated and I get angry, and this is not about cynicism about the future. This is literally about like, it's like the big collective sigh, is that there's almost this mentality that because I chose not to have children, I don't care about the future.
Yes.
And it's infuriating because you see people who chose to have children who are like actively like not thinking about their contributions to climate change or their contributions to the inhabitability of our future planet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that people have to get over that. And, I think that we go through these cycles. You look at populations over long periods and they change. There are these periods of contraction. And I think that we are in a period of contraction. And to some degree, that's a natural process. I think that there's this assumption that what's always natural is to keep procreating. I do think the contraction can be associated with certain kinds of losses and certain kinds of despair. And I spent time in Japan this past year where that was a country that was had this young population. Their economy grew. They were kind of vibrant, and then they people had low birth rates, and there are all these empty houses. But the truth is that that's part of a kind of natural cycle too. It is associated with wealth. I think you see it in wealthier countries. They have younger populations will generate a kind of wealth when there are resources. It doesn't always happen in places where there aren't the same access to resources. But then they have these strong economies, and then they contract. And I think the first, some of the pronatalists would just kind of say, no, we have to keep this going, rather than to think, this is also a natural response to conditions. And I think that it doesn't make sense for the human population to grow and grow and grow at exponential rates, which
Right.
doesn't mean
Unchecked.
and I'm not a believer in like social sculpting and engineering of populations, but I think to some degree we do this there. And it's about sometimes resources, about there not being enough to go around, but it also can be kind of there's an existential or spiritual or moral dimension of it too, of collectively there's a kind of pulling back. I mean, if you look at the charts of population growth, it is wild to see just how much populations have grown. And this goes back to the point I made just about us living longer. Some of this doesn't have to do with birth rates going up. It just has to do with the fact that people are living a lot longer and a lot more children are surviving infancy, which does change things. It's hard to think about what exactly that means, but it may mean that we have fewer children. I don't think it should mean we don't have children, but there may be this period of dialing back and figuring out a sustainable way to live on the planet, to work out our problems, to address, poverty and homelessness, and to really think about the people that we have. I guess, where I'm always concerned in this is where it kind of turns against the human and where there's a kind of anti-humanism that can drive it. I would say I'm always still sort of pro-human, but it's not about quantity. It's about the lives we have.
That's a good way to put it, because I think it can always be oversimplified to a point where it's no longer a reasonable argument. And one of the examples that I see in that a lot is the sort of correlation between reduced birth rates and empowerment of women. Literally, that when women are educated and they have access to quote unquote family planning tools, when they have access to contraception and when they have access to abortion, they on average produce fewer children. And that's because maybe those children that were produced in the past would not have been produced by choice. And I think that that's a really complicated conversation, because it's very easy to make that into an anti-natality conversation when it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that, when you look at something like abortion, a lot of the women who are choosing abortions are mothers. So these very often aren't women who don't want to be mothers or are anti-children. They're, often low income, and they are dealing with real limitations. And they're trying to make a decision for not just themselves, but they're very often their families. That is about, taking care of what they have and doing what's within their power. So I think the question of human limits is very interesting to me.
Well, and it's also interesting that even within that statement that, many women who have abortions are mothers, but some are not. And I feel like there's also no value judgment there either. You know what I mean? Like whether somebody chooses to have one or none or two or three, so long as they made that choice, and that choice wasn't made for them by the restrictions placed on their abilities to choose. I think that is still always going to be humanistic and pro-person. And it becomes anti-humanistic when the choices are limited or removed. Although I think that that can very easily be PR twisted into a conversation about anti-natality, and it often is, right? So that's why we've had to be so careful, like pro-choice versus pro-life, those are not opposites. Why are those the terms that we use, right? Because of how they're spun.
Yeah, and I resist a little bit the language of choice just because, and I wouldn't discard it, but I think in only thinking of these as individual choices that people made, it kind of obscures the larger picture that these things these happen in community, in society. If you have a lot of individual people making this particular choices, it has something to do about the culture that they're in. So I think
True.
that,
So the idea is not so much that they don't have a choice. The idea is that a choice is not divorced from all of the social pressures around it.
yeah, I think that some of the language of choice both gives all that to a woman, which can be very good, but it also kind of attributes all the blame, in which to women too. That we don't tend to think of these things as part of a larger picture. All the choices that we made are made in relation to other people, to built environments, to natural environments, to economic realities, political realities. So I think that, particularly with something like the criminalization of abortion, you have all of the blame heaped on people who are making decisions that in many ways were constrained by broader realities. And there's no kind of conversation about what those broader realities are.
My fear is that the counter argument to that is that the criminalization of abortion is often born from what is ostensibly viewed as a social norm or something where collectively the people, not the individual, but the people have chosen that um, is the structure in which to operate. So it's like, it's interesting that yes, there is the collective and there's the individual, and they are both real and they both interact, and both of those streams can be used to argue for different value judgments.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that birth is really hard in terms of these conversations because birth involves experiences that kind of disrupt this binary we have, or this individualized sense we have of the self. And so we don't really have categories. You look at some of the legal language, and it just struggles to how are we going to define or defend these questions. I think we kind of need better metaphors, and that are more in tune to birth. I mean, part of the challenge is that birth, like death, is unlike almost everything else we go through. And some of the ways we try to make sense of them have to do with things that aren't actually particularly relevant.
And also, we haven't really discussed the nature of birth being an intersubjective experience. Like, I might be birthed, but my mother is birthing me. And so, on the one hand, like we talked about this sort of the unknown, right? Like, we don't remember being born. We don't really have a, a capability to be reflective of the experience, just like nobody really knows what it feels like to die. These are like the deepest sort of, frontiers, which is why I think they hold so much space in our consciousness, and why so many pages of philosophy are dedicated to this. But at the same time, mom knows what it's like to birth. And there is no partner in death in that way. You know what I mean? Like, birthing requires two actors. And that's really fascinating to me, that when we talk about natality, we're not just talking about the being that is born, but we're also talking about the being that gave birth.
It's always plural. I mean, you could say, oh, what about a baby that grows in a test tube? But obviously, you have a team of scientists and doctors and nurses in that case who are there. And of course, the sperm and the egg still came from from human bodies. And, it may reach a point where it gets further and further from the human body. But, for all of history up until this point, and for most people who are birthing today, this is an experience that is about other people and human plurality. And I think it's we don't have great language to describe that experience. I think this is part of why the mother and the child are often pitted against each other, and so you're supposed to favor one over the other. But these are both lives that we have to consider. They might be lives in different states. You might say this isn't a person until it reaches a certain point, but there is still biological life there, and it's existing in one body. I mean, it's kind of wild to me. And also that, we think of it only in terms of pregnancy and childbirth, but in fact, many of sciences look at how we are these ecosystems, that we are hosts for all these different kinds of life that are birthing and dying in us all the time. We almost never think about ourselves or our bodies that way. I think that some of that work could probably, provide rich resources for thinking about childbirth.
Yeah, and I think that when we talk about the sort of the philosophical reflection of what it means to be an individual, we often use that term individual, and at least in kind of in my field in psychology, we often grapple with what it means to be a self and how the self is constructed only in relation to other selves. Like, these sort of feral studies show deep kind of, I don't know what the right word would be, maybe disability, deep pathologies in sense of self when somebody has no other human beings to have experiences with. And I think about my friend who has this baby, and how often we would reflect on the idea that, like, her baby doesn't have a sense of self yet, and her baby is an extension of her, and that, like, when she is stressed and like experiencing overt anxiety, like, her baby is very attuned to that anxiety because she doesn't know how to individuate yet. Her baby doesn't see herself as a being and her mother as her caretaker. Her baby doesn't know how to think that way. And for all intents and purposes, it's just as reasonable to think that the baby doesn't see mom as anything except part of the baby. And I think that that's a really kind of interesting way to think about that process of being, especially as we are developing the neurological architecture and the experiential foundation to start to individuate, to start to have a sense of self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I have nothing to add there. You can cut that part out.
It happens.
Well,
I'm curious.
I will say that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm interested in this politically because I think that a lot of the discourse politically becomes either about a kind of turbocharged individuality. It's all about individual choice, the unencumbered self. And then, of course, there's this like collectivist discourse that's on the other angle. And it's hard to kind of articulate positions that acknowledge both, that we are part of these webs of relation. We exist in community. We need community. Humans are social beings. But some of the collectivist thinking can become very dangerous. And
Of course,
if you're thinking of the what's the greater good of the whole, there will be, that's where you get into eugenics language, where maybe it doesn't make sense to have these poor members of our society or the disabled, or and so from a kind of utilitarian standpoint, there are arguments that can be made about the good of the collective that would go completely in violation of the rights or good of the individual. So yeah, I mean, in my own mind, I'm constantly trying to figure out how to balance these two.
Yeah, and
Certainly when
I
it
think
comes,
they are balanceable, right? Like there it doesn't have to necessarily be a binary. I think that we love to think in binaries, but that almost every time we try to engage with the practicality of an experience, that it's more that reality is ambivalent. Reality is that two different binary states can be true at the same time. And how do we, it's not about choosing, it's about sitting with that ambivalence and learning what the best sort of gray area approach might be.
yes, and with all of these things, I think there are these contradictions, and it's, part of our experience is learning to live with them in the same way we learn to live with the mysteries and limitations of birth and death. That there are these parts of our lives we can study, we can think through and talk through and develop arguments about, but on some level, we won't necessarily solve them. It's not about finding the perfect argument or even, having some perfect stance. It's about learning how to live with experiences that can be quite contradictory.
Right. Yeah. I agree. And I think that, I think about the way that you approach this book, which is we haven't even really spent much time on, and, we're starting to run low on time. But I love the way that you approach this book, wherein you thought about these sort of influential thinkers and you dug deep into your conceptualization of their conceptualization of natality and sort of, what did they contribute to thought? Where were they sort of maybe coalescing and building upon one another, whether they knew it or not? And where were they parting ways and in conflict? And I think that this is a really important sort of phenomenological way to dig into knowledge, right? Is to get to the heart of the people who have grappled with things and to get to the heart of what they thought and then grapple with it ourselves. And I feel like, I don't know, we don't do that enough. We don't. We talk about learning from history and we talk about learning from influential thinkers, and then we turn around and try and reinvent the wheel over and over. And so I really appreciate sort of the reverence that comes from actually doing that in practice, even though it's not always sexy, right? I think we're a culture of, I have a new idea and let me share it with you. But come on, really, it's about, who somebody already said this, and let's grapple with that.
Yeah, it was a book really about establishing a chorus. I'm not interested in natality as one's kind of single minded idea or argument that one person makes, and that's supposed to make sense for everyone. I'm really interested in human plurality. What does it mean to live in community in relation to other people, to share lives together, to also understand that there are always these differences and these gulfs in our understanding, kind of in our own personal lives, but also, the ways we respond to people in history. We're separated by time and space. And so to try to think about how do we develop a framework that holds as much of this together in some kind of coherent way and generously. I think that this is, in terms of just a method of thinking, um, it's not really what we are trained to do if you are an academic or if you are, spent your life as an op-ed columnist or something. But for me, it grew out of being a mother, having children, having like a bunch of people on a daily basis. I have to balance the competing aims and desires and frustrations. It also comes out of being an editor where, I have published hundreds of authors, and like you with your podcast, you're trying to constantly kind of understand what other people's lives have been and trying to find, trying to understand their voices and allow their voices to be heard. So these are, as an approach, it kind of emerged out of what my experience has been. So in some ways, I couldn't really do something very different. It would have felt unnatural to me to not kind of let different voices be heard and to try to maybe not completely harmonize them, but again, to hold them side by side and to kind of give them airing.
Yeah, I think sometimes um, we are uncomfortable when we can't settle everything, when we can't come to some sort of like clean conclusion and harmonize everything and say, here is a sort of simplified outcome. But I think it's an important practice and a very humanistic practice to sit with maybe not discord, but complication, and to learn how to be okay with that. And I think that that's a really important approach that you took here. I'm curious, Jennifer, before we sort of wrap up, and I always ask my guests the same two questions, so I'm curious about your answers. But before we dive into those, is there anything, obviously there's probably a million things, but is there anything out in front that we haven't discussed that you feel like, ooh, we can't end without going there together?
No, I think we covered a lot. Great questions.
Oh, great answers and great new questions. And it's been a fascinating conversation. So I'm going to ask you two more questions that are really big picture questions. And because of the way that you think and the way that you write, I'm extra curious about how you want to approach these. I ask every guest on the show, when you think about the future, in whatever context feels relevant to you right in this moment. So this could be personal, professional, individual, social, cultural, global, cosmic. Like, you choose how you want to contextualize these questions. First, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night? The thing you're legitimately concerned about? Maybe you're starting to venture into that pessimistic or even cynical territory. And then on the flip side of that, where are you finding hope, optimism, and like, what are you authentically, truly looking forward to?
Yeah, I think the things that concern me the most are the aversion I feel as part of a global culture to reality. um, this has to do with to each other, but also to our circumstances, our moment in time. Um, it's easy to critique. I think we're in an age of criticism, and criticism is hugely important. But I am interested in, what do we affirm? What can we find in our daily lives, in our experience that we can affirm and commit to? And, I think for me, I'm on a daily basis, I'm just kind of wowed by the world we live in. People, but also just the natural world. Maybe it's a sense that some of this is so precarious, um, but it's just so beautiful,
Hmm.
and it's so rich. And some of the aversion I see, I've been reading a lot in the transhumanist literature, and there is this kind of dream of escaping the Earth. It's this a kind of SpaceX. We're going to colonize outer space, and we're not going to be bound by these bodies and this degraded Earth, this polluted planet. And I think that maybe I have some allegiance to the Earth. That's
Same.
what.
I take real
Yeah.
issue with these kind of like uh, space colonial kind of mentalities, and this idea that somehow we're going to be able to just like terraform some other planet. Like, we're not even good at using the planet that we evolved on. Like, like, we are completely like, how are we going to actually do that to a planet that we didn't even evolve in lockstep with? It's so far-fetched to me, yet I don't know why the rhetoric has really grabbed a lot of people's attention.
Yeah, and the idea of living in outer space has zero appeal for me, and that might,
Right,
at
same.
some point be a very old-fashioned thing. But at this point in time, we have this amazing, beautiful planet that we live on that's full of problems and, is threatened in all kinds of ways. But I think to commit to that and to attend to it and to notice it and to be grateful for it, that's really kind of what gets me up. And obviously everything that's a part of it. So our families, our friendships, and biological life in all of its forms. When you read some of the threats that we'll face, it's not just humans. It's there's these kind of predictions of the eradication of all biological life. So we're sort of in this all together.
Yeah, and something that I would almost add to that, because I have to say that I agree so deeply with these views, is that a lot of the problems that we do face, not all, but I'd say the vast majority, are not logistically impossible. They're just difficult because of willpower. They're difficult because of
Exactly.
coordination. We have solutions in front of us. We're just not using them.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
And as much as it could be easy to get cynical about that and be like, then we're doomed, I think the other side of it is like, no, there is an instruction manual right in front of us of how we can mitigate or even solve these issues. We just need to get our shit together to do it.
Yeah, and if we can find ways to go colonize other planets, can't we find ways to distribute food? It's like
Right.
that can't be quite that hard.
100%. Oh my
Or
gosh, agree
work on a cure for
wholeheartedly.
cancer, or I feel like this is where our resources should go. Doesn't mean we shouldn't, explore and that shouldn't be out there as a possibility. But in terms of where we really want to concentrate, I'm still bound to the earth.
Same. Well, gosh, everybody, the book is Natality: Toward a Philosophy of Birth by Jennifer Banks. Jennifer, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. It was so enlightening. It was so challenging. And I really think that the folks who are listening, or I hope at least that they enjoyed it just as much as I did.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk through it.